Hi guys, welcome back to Bobco Astro. My name is Bob and today I want to talk to you about N.I.N.A. The way I use N.I.N.A for my setup, and I'll talk about that in a second, and to see if there's anything in the way I do things that may be of interest to you, that you may find useful. Also interested to learn from you. What do you think about the way I do it? Is it too complicated? Do you like it? Are there aspects of it that you like, some that you don't? Let me know in the comments down below. So that's what we're going to be looking at. First of all, what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about my setup so that you know where I'm coming from. We all come at N.I.N.A and our imaging from slightly different aspects. Some people are using mono cameras, dedicated astro cameras. So for my setup, I'm using a William Optics GT81 Mark IV refractor. I'm coupling that with either a 0.8 times reducer, or using some of my camera equipment, I'm using a 1.4 times Nikon teleconverter. Now, depending on which one of those I'm using will obviously impact the settings in N.I.N.A, and we'll talk about that later. Coupled onto that, I'm using a Canon or a Nikon DSLR, depending on the subject that I'm looking at, whether we're talking galaxy or nebula. The Canon is astro modified, the Nikon is standard. So that's my equipment, and that will impact obviously the way I use N.I.N.A and the aspects of it that may be important to you, may not be important to you. I will chapter this video so you can skip over the areas that are of less interest to you and move to the bits that are more important, or you can easily find those areas again if you want to reassess or look back and check out the areas that are more applicable to you. So without any further preamble, let's get into N.I.N.A and see what we're looking at. Okay, so here we are in N.I.N.A. Now, first things first, I cannot get my cursor to appear on the video. I don't know why, but I can't get my cursor to appear. Hopefully when I scroll up and down across the various tabs, you'll see them turning blue, and I'll try and highlight what I'm doing in other ways. But as you can see, we started up in the options tab and options and general, and you can see that I set my N.I.N.A up with a dark profile. It's just so that I can use it outside without it interfering too much with my night vision. You'll also see that I'm set up for nightly updates, and I'm currently looking at version 2 on release 001. Is there anything else to say on this page? Let's have a quick look. You might see here that I've got on the Sky Survey cache folder that I do have an offline cache loaded so that I can use N.I.N.A when I'm at a dark site with no internet connection, and I'll go through that with you a bit later on. Other than that, it's just my profile setup. So if we come down the tabs on the left hand side here, from options general, we can come down to options equipment, and you see I've got my camera parameters set up, bit scaling, all basic setup here for my DSLR cameras. You can see the telescope, I'm using the EQ6R Pro telescope. Now the focal length and the focal ratio here will change depending on whether I'm using my Nikon or my Canon on either a focal reducer or a teleconverter, and I'll go through that with you when I go through the sequencer setup. But there are some settings in here that I will have to change on a nightly basis, potentially, depending on what target I'm going for. Weather, I don't use any external weather apps here. I do have a Pegasus Astro power box connected, and that has a sensor on it which does detect temperature and humidity, so that populates, and I'll show you that further down. Planetarium over here, you see I've got Stellarium. I use Stellarium in the background, and I often use Stellarium to set up initially my target and then import the coordinates into the framing tab, and again I'll go through that with you when we get to that point. Autofocus, I'm using the ZWO EAF, and most of these settings here will stay as they are. In fact, they'll all stay as they are, so you might want to make a note of these if you're using a similar setup to me. The one thing that does change is the autofocus step size. I discovered only recently that if I'm using a teleconverter as opposed to using the focal reducer, it should have been obvious to me really, but I didn't realize that the autofocus step size will change, and we'll have a little discussion about that when we get to that point on my sequence. But I am finding here that when I'm using a teleconverter, I've got an autofocus step size of 40 with the initial offset steps of 4. When I'm using a reducer, the initial offset steps will stay the same, but the autofocus step size will actually increase to 70. As I say, I discovered that only recently after a few failed autofocus attempts. I don't have a dome, so I'm not looking at that. And on imaging, I have this set up on the image file pattern here. This will basically create a new folder each time I start a target, and it will have a folder with the target name. In that folder will be a folder with the camera details. Inside that will be a folder with the application start date, and inside that will be a folder with the image type, and then the images will come in with their image number, target details, date and time, temperature settings, and ISO settings. And that works quite well for me. I find that everything self-populates. I don't need to go hunting for it. I know exactly where it's going to be. Meridian flip settings, there's not much to say about these. You experiment with your own details, but these are my figures over here on the right hand side. I find these work perfectly. I don't have any issue with these settings. So I suggest that might be something you might want to look at copying across if you're using a similar setup to me. Image options there, I haven't really touched those. I'm using Hocus Focus for star detection, N.I.N.A for star annotation, and Hocus Focus for autofocus, and that works really, really well. Advanced settings, stretch factor and black clipping are the default settings. I've got star sensitivity set to normal and noise reduction off. Coming down to the sequence, this is where your individual folders or files that run N.I.N.A are going to sit. They will be individual for your particular setup. I've disabled the simple sequencer. I use the advanced sequencer for all of my astrophotography, and I've asked it to collapse the sequence templates by default just to declutter the screen when we first open up. And that's about it on the imaging tab. Moving across to plate solving. I'm using PlateSolve 2 for plate solving. I was using ASTAP, and ASTAP was working very well for me. I did have one session where ASTAP messed around a little bit, and I tried PlateSolve 2 and it worked even better, and PlateSolve 2 has worked every single time. So I'm setting up to use PlateSolve 2, but I do have ASTAP on here as a backup if required, and then my blind solver is astrometry.net. Exposure time, again, this is DSLR settings, so just a 5-second at 6400 ISO, and that usually works very well for me with the DSLR. Nothing much more to say on plate solving. So coming up to our equipment tab, as you can see, I've got the Canon EOS 600D here. Now that's my main astro imaging camera. It's a modified DSLR. I was also using my Nikon D500, but lately I cannot get it to connect. If anybody else is experiencing these problems, let me know in the comments down below, and let me know if you found a solution. I've got no idea why. I've reinstalled N.I.N.A. I've gone from Windows 10 to Windows 11. I've even looked at the software on the firmware on the camera and rolled the firmware back because it seemed to tie in with a firmware upgrade on the camera. I've done everything I can. I cannot get my Nikon D500 to connect. So at the moment I'm restricted completely on N.I.N.A to my Canon 600D, but I'm getting some good images with that, so I am happy. But I would like to get the Nikon working again. Let me know in the comments if you're having any similar issues. But yeah, it's a bit of a problem at the moment. Not using filter wheel. My focuser, as I say, is the ZWO, the EAF, and I've got set positions on my focuser that I've made a note of, and made a note of those in the sequencer, and I'll go through those with you when we get there. Rotator. I have a manual rotator on my William Optics GT81, and what you can do in N.I.N.A is set up a manual rotator here, and when you get to when you've framed a target in your framing wizard and sent it across to a sequencer, when you get to a set point on your sequence and the image plate solves, it will know the orientation that you're looking for, and it will tell you, it will stop the sequence at that point, and it will tell you to go out and manually rotate your camera, say 20 degrees anti-clockwise or 30 degrees clockwise. And that's really easy to do if you've got a manual rotator on your setup. So that's why I use that one here. Telescope, as we know, we're using the EQ6R, and I connect that with EQ Mod ASCOM. Works very well. Guide, I'm using PhD2. The only thing I'll change here is on the settings, and that's the amount of pixels that I have in the settings here for dithering. And you can hear, where are we on my dither pixels here. You'll see that I've got it set for 3 pixels, and on my PhD2 software I've got it to scale ×2, and they change also depending on whether I'm using the teleconverter or the reducer, and I'm basically looking to dither by approximately 30 pixels on the imaging sensor. And there's a few videos on YouTube that you can look at that will tell you how to calculate those settings for your particular guide camera and imaging camera setup. For the switch, I've got the Pegasus Astro PowerBox Advance. That's set up on my system to power everything, and I use the N.I.N.A to control a lot of those power outputs, including to power my DSLR. And I use that a lot in my shutdown sequence as well. Shut down things individually and power them off individually before I shut the computer down, which is all done by N.I.N.A, and I'll show you that later. Weather also is from the PowerBox Advance, just so that the PowerBox Advance will be monitoring the temperature and humidity and give me information on that. Don't have a dome and don't have a safety monitor. So that's all of my equipment. Sky Atlas, there's not a lot to say in Sky Atlas. I don't tend to use it. I do tend to populate things across from Stellarium. I do tend to find my targets in Stellarium and then import them over onto the framing tab. So on the framing tab, a couple of things to talk about. On the image source, I use the Hips to Fits Sky survey when I've got an internet connection. If I'm out at a dark site and I don't have an internet connection, I use the offline sky map, which I've got set up as an offline cache on the computer here. So it will give me the details that I'm after out in a dark site with no internet connection. Coordinates, especially if I know I'm going to a dark site, I'll set this up prior to going. So I'll find my target in Stellarium, I'll get the camera rotation that I'm looking for in Stellarium, and then I'll import those details across using the Get Coordinates from Planetarium button. I can then load the image with the offline sky map, check my rotation, and then port those details across to the target sequence. The only thing that changes in here, depending on my setup, depending on whether I'm using the teleconverter or the reducer, will be the camera parameter details here. If the camera changes, then the width and height of these pixels will change, as will the pixel size, and if I'm using either the reducer or the teleconverter, that will have an impact on my focal length. So I do need to make sure that these details are set correctly, otherwise I can have problems with the framing, and also I need to make sure those details are set so that I don't have problems with my plate solving later on, and we'll talk about that when I get to the sequencer. Flat Wizard here, I do use a Flat Wizard. It's a fantastic piece of kit, especially with the DSLR. I take 20 flats as a standard. I was taking 15, but they take minutes to take, so 20 I find is a good number. I take 20 flats, 20 darks, 20 bias on all of my images, and it works really well. I have a histogram mean target here of 30%, and you can see the rest of the settings here, and I just let the camera do its thing. Once I've got my light box, I don't use a white t-shirt. I'll show you what I do use. I use one of these. This is a crocheting circle with a piece of white t-shirt material stretched across, and that sits down on top of the camera, giving you that white t-shirt effect. I then put the iPad down on top of that with a plain white screen, and then the Flat Wizard takes all of the photos automatically. Really good, really easy to do. Okay, now we, in fact, I won't move along to the sequencer just yet. We'll have a look at our imaging tab. Now this is really an individual thing as to how you set this up. You'll see the way I've got it set up. I'll give you a moment to have a look at that, and there's really nothing to say here. It's just individual preferences. I've seen it set up in a very similar way to this from other YouTubers, and yeah, it's just intuitive for me. It works really well. I've got the telescope information over here, top left, focuser underneath, and manual focus targets down here. I use this primarily to get my my initial focus. I see what's up in the sky at the time, what I can easily see and access, pick a target and slew to it, then use the Bartonov mask to get my initial focus before setting my sequencer off and running. Plugins, I suppose we should discuss plugins, but I think I might leave that for a separate video. So let's go and have a look at our advanced sequencer. This is where all the magic happens. Okay, advanced sequencer time. Now you can see as I go into advanced sequencer, you can see I've got something set up here already, which is called my sequence bracket. And what I've got is a start routine and an end routine already set up. What I've done is I've set those up individually, and then I've saved them down here into a JSON file. If you open up JSON files here, you see it's in my N.I.N.A sequence folder, and if I scroll down you'll see that I've got the sequence bracket here. Now what I've done is I've set that up separately, and then I've saved it into that sequence folder, and then on options, imaging, on the right hand side you'll see my startup sequence. I'll show you here my startup sequence template, which I've just highlighted there for you. That will open up that sequence when you first open N.I.N.A every time. As long as you save it in your sequence folders, make a link to it down here on the right hand side here, and then every time you start N.I.N.A up you will have that sequence set up. It's the same sequence I use every time, which is why I do it. And there's a start sequence and an end sequence, which will always be the same. There'll be some minor tweaks depending on what's going on the night, but predominantly they're always going to be the same. The only thing that's going to change is the sequence target area section in the middle. So let's have a look at this sequence bracket and see what I've done when I've set this up. Now you see in my start area I've got home start. Now the reason I've called it home start is I have a home start and I have an away start. The only difference between the two of them is that on the away start I've got a little reminder set for me to turn notifications off if I don't have an internet connection. And what I don't want the sequence to be doing is go away and trying to contact me via email or contact me via the Pushover app if there's no internet connection. So it's basically a reminder for me to deactivate those notifications. So if we open up home start, and you can see up here in the trigger, one of the first things I've got here is failures to Pushover. Pushover app on my mobile phone. If anything in the system fails, does not work, I will get an alarm to my mobile phone to let me know that something's fallen over and that I need to pay it some attention. In the instructions here, you'll see I've got loads of annotations, and these are all reminders for me when I'm setting up the session for an evening. First and foremost is a reminder for me to, if I've got no internet coverage, to disable those notifications. Our second one down here is a reminder for me to make some minor adjustments to my focal reducer if I'm using or not using a filter in the image train for my DSLR. I just need to make a minor adjustment on the focal reducer to adjust back focus if I'm using a filter or not using a filter, and this just tells me the number of degrees that I need to move the back focus adjustment on the focal reducer if I'm using a filter. So this next reminder for me relates to remote copy. Now I use remote desktop to control the mini PC that's on my rig, and the images that are taken on my camera are copied onto that remote PC. And what I'm doing is I'm remote desktop connecting to it either through my Mac or through my laptop PC. So as you can see here, I've got a MacBook and a ThinkPad, and depending on which one of those I'm using dictates that I need to delete or switch off the robocopy instruction for the other one. So if I'm using my MacBook, I will come down here to my robocopy start routine. This one here relates to my Y drive, which is my MacBook, and the next one down, this one here, relates to my Z drive, which is my laptop. And depending on which one I'm using to remote desktop in, I will disable the instruction for the other one. So what robocopy will do is it will monitor the image folder on my remote PC, and as images are loaded into that folder, it remote copies them over the network to my PC or my Mac, so that I don't have to do that separately later on. Our next reminder down asks me to ensure that the correct system settings are in place, and those system settings that need changing are listed in the next number of annotations that I've got here on the system. So what this is telling me is that I need to set the correct autofocus step size in options autofocus, and that means if I'm using my reducer, I need to be using a step size of 70, and if I'm using a teleconverter, I need to be using a step size of 40. So it's a reminder for me to go away and do that and make sure I've got the correct settings in place before I start the sequence off. Next one down is telling me that I need to set the correct GPS settings in equipment telescope settings, and also in options general astrometry, and that really only changes if I'm away from home. So if I'm away from home at a dark site, then I need to make sure that I've got those GPS settings plugged into my telescope, plugged into N.I.N.A, so that my targeting will be correct, and my plate solving will know where I am. So the next one down is a reminder for me to set the correct scope and camera parameters. Now this changes if I'm using the teleconverter or the reducer. It also changes if I'm using either the Canon or the Nikon DSLR. So I need to go and make sure that all those settings in the framing tab and in the options equipment tab are correct, otherwise I'm going to have problems with plate solving later on in the session. Next down we have just a set of reminders with setting up those scope and camera parameters. The next few annotations are the reminders that give me the information I need to port across. So it gives me my sensor size and my pixel size for the individual cameras, and the focal lengths and focal ratios that will change depending on my setup. So these are just reminders for me to set and port across to those settings that I need to change that I've listed above. Further down here we've got a reminder to set the correct dither settings, again dependent on whether I'm using the reducer or teleconverter. The number of pixels in the dither settings for PhD will change accordingly. And I've got a reminder here. I've got PPEC set up on the mount, periodic error correction, and that doesn't turn on automatically. I have to make sure that once the EQ mod is running and controlling the scope, that I go into my scope settings and tick the box for PPEC to run. So again, it's just a reminder for me that I have to do that. Next down, the sequence starts properly. So when I start the sequence up, it's going to tick box everything that we've already talked about, because they're just reminders and annotations, and it's going to tick those straight away. And then it's going to come down to here, which is my wait for time. Usually I will set this sequence up and running before I'm actually going to sequence. I'll make sure everything's set up correctly, everything's done to my liking, and then I'll set it going. And the first thing it's going to do, it's going to wait for the time that I've set it to go off at. Usually that will be either astronomical dusk or astronomical dark, and that's my instruction for the sequence to actually start up proper. Next down we've got connect all the equipment. Usually I've got that done, but just in case there's anything I've forgotten, that will be connected at this point. And then that's our robocopy start that we've already discussed, and one of those will be set and one of those will be disabled depending on which computer I'm using to remote access the mini PC with. Center pushover is a notification for me, if I'm not monitoring the system at that time, that the sequence has started and it's up and running. Next down we have an instruction to unpark the scope, and if I haven't done so already, to move the focuser to a set position. Now I've got two positions noted here depending on whether I'm using my reducer or my teleconverter, and that will get me in the ballpark of focus. So what I can do, if I haven't set up and done a Bartinoff mask focus routine, then I can just come in here, get the focus to set it up to a rough position, and then allow autofocus to hopefully do its thing. Usually I will have set up focus with a Bartinoff mask beforehand, and I will disable the next instruction, which is the move focuser to set position. And that is my start sequence that I will do every time. In essence, it's the majority of it is just reminders for me to get the correct settings before I start, which will save a lot of heartache later down the line if I haven't got it right. Okay, let's close this home start sequence down, and we can then come and have a look in this central area, our sequence target area. Now again, I've got a sequence set up, which is a sequence that I always use, and if we come up here to templates, and down here I've got my home deep sky sequence. So let's bring that across and see what we're looking at. If we open it up, the first thing we're going to see is the target area. As you can see, that's not populated at the moment, and what I will do is I will bring that across from my framing wizard once that's been done, and import that into this sequence. And as we scroll down, we've got these notification triggers, the failures to push over, which I've already discussed, and I've got an IFTTT setting, that's if this then that, if you're not familiar with IFTTT, and it's a back office program that will run, and this basically gives me a similar notification to the pushover notification, but it sends that notification to my Amazon Alexa device. So if I've gone to bed and I'm in bed and a failure happens on the system, then Alexa will notify me that there's a problem and to get my backside out of bed and go and sort it out. If we come down to the next area down, I've got a little annotation to tell me, remind me where my custom horizon settings are if they don't populate for some reason. For those of you that don't know, you can set up custom horizons in N.I.N.A, which in the target area here will show you an artificial horizon line, so you can tell when your target is going to be above any particular obstructions that you may have at your site if you've preset that up. Moving down to our first set of instructions. Again, I've got an annotation here just to remind me what that if this then that trigger does, just to remind me that I need to disable it if I'm not going to bed and sitting up and staying with this program. First instruction we've got then is to slew, center and rotate on target. Now, slew and center is pretty obvious. The telescope's going to slew to target. It's then going to plate solve to center on target. And then that manual focuser comes in. So what it will do then, it will give me a message box that will tell me that I need to manually rotate my camera X amount of degrees clockwise or anti-clockwise. It stops the sequence there until I've okayed that message box. So what I need to do at that point is go out to the scope, manually rotate the DSLR to the required point, come back in and okay that. It will then go and do another plate solve, check that I've got the rotation correct before going to the next section and starting the guiding. Force calibration I've got off. I don't want it to calibrate every time I open PhD. As long as I haven't done anything significant to to my guiding parameters, then the calibration should be absolutely fine. And next it will run an autofocus, and that's where I find out whether I've got those correct step sizes in place. Then I've got a message box here that comes up and tells me to pause sequence and take a trial image to assess the ISO and exposure time on target. Now I'll have an idea in my mind as to what I want my exposure time to be and my ISO to be. So this is the point where I go off to my imaging tab, actually fire off the camera, take an image at the time scale and the ISO that I think is right, and make an assessment and find out if that is correct or whether I need to adjust it. And once I've done that, once I've made that assessment, any changes that I need to make will be made further down in the sequence before we start it off. Now, what happens as soon as you OK that message box, it moves to the next section of your sequence. So just so that you've got enough time to pause that and go away and do what you need to do, I've put a wait for time span of 5 seconds. So that message box will come up, it will tell me to pause the sequence and go away and make that assessment as to the image length and ISO. But while that message box is up, I can't do anything else within N.I.N.A. I have to OK that message box before I can then move on. And if I don't have this 5-second delay in the system, then it straight away moves to the next point, which is actually taking the photos. And I don't want it to do that. So I have this pause for 5 seconds. So I OK the message box. It's then in a holding pattern for 5 seconds, which gives me enough time to come down and pause the sequence. I can then go away and take those photographs before coming back, starting the sequence off again, and then it will finish off that 5-second countdown before it then moves on. But as I say, if I don't have that 5-second delay in there, as soon as I OK the message box, it moves down and it's starting to take photos, and I don't want that. I need to set up my my time and ISO settings correctly first. So finally, we're getting down to the business section, and we're actually going to start taking photos. So we move along to our capture sequence, and here I've got a number of triggers that I'm setting. So first of all, let's have a look down here at our instructions themselves. I've got a little annotation here, a little reminder to tell me what my optimum ISO settings are for my individual cameras based on read noise and dynamic range. And here's my instruction for taking exposures. So I'll just have the one exposure here to take, but I will loop that instruction, and I'll loop it until a certain time, and usually that time will be astronomical dawn, and I'll set that up when I know what it means. It might be a loop until a particular time, but if my target disappears below my horizon before then I'll have this loop condition above here, loop until altitude is below, and I'll have an indication of what my where the target will be when it disappears behind my shed or my tree in my backyard, and I'll loop those exposures until it gets down to that altitude. I have a 5-second delay between exposures that I put in just to allow my sensor to cool down a little bit before I go and take the next exposure. And all of these are underneath the following triggers. And when we look at our triggers, what we're going to do is we're going to autofocus if we get a 10% increase in our star HFR trend. So after every 10 exposures, it's going to do it's going to look at the information that's coming in for each image, and if there's been a 10% change in the HFR over those 10 exposures, then we're going to it's automatically going to do a autofocus. Next down, I've got autofocus after temperature change. So again, what that's going to do is that's going to constantly monitor the outside temperature using my PowerBox Advance, the sensor that's attached to that. And if there's a 3-degree rise or drop in the temperature from the point where we started the sequence off, then we're going to do another autofocus. We've got a meridian flip in here so that if our target moves across the meridian, then the system will automatically flip the scope. You won't need to do anything with the rotation of the camera. Everything will be set up. It will do the flip. It will reacquire the target and plate solve and make sure it's all on, and then it will just carry on. Center after drift, again, after 10 exposures, it will perform a plate solve in the background and assess to see if there has been any drift. And I've put a drift here of 3 arc minutes, which on my system at the moment equates to 136 pixels. So if we get that amount of drift, it will do a plate solve and reposition, re-slew the scope. Restore guiding, so if for any reason the clouds come in and we lose our guiding, it's automatically going to restore because we've got this instruction set here, and it's going to set PHD2 back up again. And dither after so many exposures. I've got dithering set for every 2 exposures. I've got quite an aggressive dither that I like to use, which I've found works really well, and I dither about 30 pixels on the imaging sensor, I find that that works quite well with the Canon, which is quite noisy with long exposures. So that's our initial capture sequence. We're going to take an exposure, wait for 5 seconds, and if the looping conditions are still met, we're going to carry on, take another exposure, wait 5 seconds, take another exposure, wait 5 seconds, until one of these loop conditions are met, or one of the triggers are set off and an autofocus or a recenter needs to take place, and that will all be monitored in the background. So that's our capture sequence before we move down to our calibration set. So once our initial light frames have been captured, we move down to calibration. So we've got a set of instructions here to stop the tracking, stop the guiding, send a notification over to my mobile phone to tell me that the captures have been completed and that I now may take the calibration frames, and it's going to bring a message box up in N.I.N.A to tell me that the imaging is complete, pause the sequence, and then proceed once the flats have been taken and the lens cover has been fitted. So once again, with a message box that will come up, and you've got to OK that before you can do anything else. But what I want to do is I want actually to pause the sequence at that point. So I've put in this, again, this 5-second time span delay after the message box. That gives me time to OK the message box. Then I've got this 5-second time period where I can come down here and pause the sequence at that point. Once I pause the sequence at that point, that's when I go across to my flat wizard. I'll use the flat wizard to slew the scope to the zenith. I'll then go out and put my cover and light box on the end of the scope, come back to my remote PC here and let the flat wizard do its thing and take my flat frames. Once that flat wizard's done its thing, I will go out, remember to take my expensive iPad off the top of my scope and put the lens cap on. I'll then come back in here to the sequence and set the sequence running again at that point. And the next thing on our list here is the sequence will park the scope. That's why I have to remember to take my iPad off the top of it before I carry on the sequence. Then I'll get another message box which will tell me that the scope has been parked, and the system will shut down after the calibration frames are complete. At this point, it's telling me to cover the scope and disable shutdown notifications if I'm going to bed, and this is a point where I often will go to bed. So what I'll do is I'll cover put the lens cap on the scope. I'll actually throw a cover over the whole thing in case we get rain at some point, and set the rest of the sequence going and go to bed and come out the next morning and see what's happened. And now is the point where our dark frames are taken. So all our images are done, all our flats are done, the scope's parked, it's covered, and now N.I.N.A is going to take the dark frames. So make sure that on the take exposure you've got the same settings here as you had for your light frames, the same time and the same gain, but this time we're making sure that we select dark frames, and this will then put them into a separate folder within your N.I.N.A imaging folder on the computer. Here I've got again a time delay after the image is taken, so it will take each image, small delay, take the next image, small delay, take the next image. And once this is done, and that will loop for 20 iterations, so 20 frames. Once that's done, it moves straight down to bias frame capture. All we need to do here is make sure that the time set is the minimum exposure time for your camera. this for me changes. I've got 0.00025 seconds, which is 1/4000th of a second for my bias frames on my Canon. It will be 0.000125 for my Nikon, which is 1/8000th of a second. These go in the bias folder, and again make sure the gain is set at the same gain as you were taking for your light frame images. And those are our calibration frames, and that concludes our home deep sky sequence. So I can collapse that down now. So once our calibration frames have been done, we'll move down to the sequence end part of our sequence bracket setup. So in my sequence end section, I've got the same notifications, which I will disable if I've got no internet connection, if I'm out at a dark sky site, and a couple of reminders, one to tell me to do that, and just another one to remind me of what the IFTTT trigger does and why I might want to disable it if I'm not at home. And then we come down to our instructions on our shutdown group here, and our shutdown group is basically just that. It's going to shut everything down. So the first thing it's going to do is park the scope. Now if everything else in the system has worked correctly, the scope will already be parked, but just in case, park the scope, move the focuser back to its 0 position, because we're done, we're finished. Let's put everything away, and then we come down to our disconnect equipment. So in no particular order, because this is a sequence where everything is going to be done at the same time, we're going to disconnect the camera, we're going to disconnect the focuser, disconnect the rotator, disconnect the telescope, disconnect the guider, and disconnect the switch controlling our weather information. Then we're going to set switch values on our Powerbox Advanced dew heaters to 0, and then move to our pre-shutdown sequence. And here, having disconnected all of the equipment above, we're then going to shut off power to the camera by setting the switch value 2 on our Powerbox Advanced to 0. We're then going to disconnect that Powerbox Advanced switch from N.I.N.A. Then there is an instruction here for robocopy to stop. Now if you're familiar with robocopy, what robocopy does is every 2 minutes it will go away, it will look at the folder that I've got set up for my images on my mini PC, and every 2 minutes it'll assess the images in that, and if there's any that aren't on my remote PC, it will copy those across, but it's every 2 minutes. So what we do, just to make sure that everything's done and dusted and boxed away, is we wait 2 minutes on our stop robocopy instruction. So robocopy stop says wait before stop 120 seconds, so that's 2 minutes. So it will then wait for that time, then it'll instruct robocopy to shut down. One last pushover notification to tell me that the advanced sequence has now completed and the scope has been parked, and then our final instruction to shut down the PC, and that will completely shut down my mini PC. So everything is disconnected, everything is now shut down, and everything is covered over. That's our night finished. So there it is. That's how I've got N.I.N.A set up, the particular settings that I use, and the way I've got my advanced sequencer set up. It's taken me a fair while to get to that stage, and lots of trial and error before I've got a system that I'm comfortable with and that works well. It seems to be working really well now. Last 3 or 4 attempts, it's been pretty flawless. So I felt confident enough to bring it to the YouTube channel and say, look, here it is, this is what I do. Am I overcomplicating it? Yeah, probably. Is it something that can help you, or are there aspects of it that you find that are interesting, some aspects that are not? Does any of it really help out your system and the way you do it? Let me know. Let me know in the comments. If you want any more information on particular aspects of it, again, ask questions, let me know what your thoughts are. But that's it. That's N.I.N.A for me, and how I use it and how I go about imaging and operating my system overnight. As I say, it's a remotely operated system, mini PC on the rig, and using DSLR cameras, Canon and Nikon, to the best advantage with the equipment that I've got. Getting some good results on it lately, so I'm pretty happy. Thanks for watching. Really great to see you again. Let me know in the comments any questions that you have, and thanks again. So till next time, stay safe and clear skies, everybody. Bye bye.